What I am now describing, incidentally, is one of many instances I could relate to you to underline Lord Darlington's essentially shy and modest nature. A great deal of nonsense has been spoken and written in recent years concerning his lordship and the prominent role he came to play in great affairs, and some utterly ignorant reports have had it that he was motivated by egotism or else ignorance. Let me say here that nothing could be further from the truth. It was completely contrary to Lord Darlington's natural tendencies to take such public stances as he came to do, and I can say with conviction that his lordship was persuaded to overcome his more retiring side only through a deep sense of moral duty. Whatever may be said about his lordship these days, and the great majority of it is, as I say, utter nonsense, I can declare that he was truly a good man at heart, a gentleman through and through, and one I am today proud to have given my best years of service to. So proclaims the butler Stevens, reminiscing on his former employer, Lord Darlington, at the start of a several days' trip to inquire if former housekeeper Miss Kenton would like to return to the hall now owned by Mr. Faraday. Whether his memories of Lord Darlington are actually representative of the man he served for the majority of his life remains to be seen. I'm Veronica, this is the Reading Chronicles, and this is the year of Kazuo Ishiguro, and this is the remains of the day. Kazuo Ishiguro does it again with this book. In what seems like the quiet reminiscences of an English butler, Ishiguro examines both history and the desire to believe that we have dedicated our lives to something that has meaning. We open in 1956 with the butler Stevens inquiring of his new American employer if he may take the employer's car on a journey to visit the former housekeeper, Miss Kenton, now Mrs. Ben. With the former Lord Darlington having gone and the house staff having dwindled, Stevens is beginning to see mistakes in the manner and believes that Miss Kenton may wish to rejoin her post at Darlington Hall. While this sets the premise for the novel, the bulk happens in Stevens' memories of his time serving Lord Darlington and the very important guests he had at the hall, particularly during the 1930s. In Europe, during which time things could be said to have happened. It's difficult to discuss this book without going into some of the particulars, so some spoilers are coming up, but Ishiguro's writing is so brilliant that I'm certain the book would still be worthwhile read, even if you know some of the major things that come to light throughout the novel. Throughout his drive, Stevens reflects on the idea of what it means to have dignity, this being what he believes separates the most distinguished butlers from those who are merely competent. And this is really the crux of the novel, this examination of whether Stevens has conducted his life in a manner that is truly dignified or one that is merely competent. Much like in Ishiguro's previous protagonists, Etsuko Sheringham in A Pale View of Hills and Masuji Ono in An Artist of the Floating World, Stevens endeavors to ensure that his life has meaning. As the reader, we begin to see some cracks in his polished exterior, flaws in his belief of what dignity means. In a number of instances, it seems that he has sacrificed being human in his effort to have dignity, the most prominent being when he insists on carrying on with his duties during an important meeting at Darlington Hall while his father lays dying upstairs. Indeed, he misses his chance to see his father in his final moments, but he comforts himself with the assertion that this is how his father, a butler himself, would have wanted it. Stevens behaves in a similarly stoic manner when Miss Kenton receives news that a close relative has died, and when she admits to being tired during one of their habitual evening meetings, he calls them off entirely despite her protestations. In his effort to be exceedingly formal at all times, always aware of decorum, he ends up hurting those around him. Stephen's dignity is no more called into question than when he reflects on the political goings-on Lord Darlington involved himself in. Through small insinuations leading to a big revelation at the end, confirming the reader's suspicions, we come to learn of Lord Darlington's involvement in the events leading up to World War II. That despite his seeming high-mindedness, which gives Stephens the opportunity to serve some high-ranking officials during that time, Darlington was little more than a pawn for Hitler, spreading Nazi propaganda in England and establishing connections between Berlin and influential people in England, including an attempt to persuade the Prime Minister to meet with Hitler. At the time that Stephens learns this information, he is resolute in his belief that Darlington is doing only what he believes is best for the country, and he trusts Darlington's judgment wholeheartedly. However, as Stephens thinks back on his time after meeting with Miss Kenton, during which she confesses that she wonders what a life might have been like with him if he had only shown a bit of sympathy and understanding to her, he asserts that Darlington wasn't a bad man, that he was courageous, and that he chose a path in life, even if that path was ultimately misguided. As for himself, Stephens realizes that he cannot claim even that, for he blindly trusted in Darlington's judgment, and what he asks is the dignity in that. All he can do is to quit looking back on his life, to adopt a more positive outlook, and try to make the most of what remains of his day. It is a quietly devastating novel, a devastation that comes from realizing that the cause to which one has chosen to dedicate one's life was not, in fact, dignified. This book was my introduction to Ishiguro. I read it probably shortly after college. I fell in love with it then, and I still love it now. Now, these parallels between Ishiguro's protagonists are not accidental. In his BBC interview with Mark Lawson, he had this to say of the similarities, particularly between his second and third books. I think I've written the same book about 3 times. I want it to be a refinement or another take on the same kinds of questions. I'd like to think that I move on. I think that the most blatant example of a remake in my case is between my second and third novels. You remove the settings, and one is Japan and one is England. You remove those, and the stories are very similar. They're about aging people who invested their best years and values that they come to see are flawed. Not only have they wasted their talents, they've actually contributed something bad. And how do they come to terms with that in the new world, in the post-World War II world? Basically, it's the same story, but I think The Remains of the Day has an extra dimension, because I think at the end of the second novel, I thought, this is all about the theme of the wasted life, but confined really to the area of careers. It's about vocation and careers. There's very little in it about your personal life, and you're talking about wasting lives. You can't just talk about it in terms of your career. Your life doesn't stand or fall just in terms of your career. For most people, career is a relatively minor thing. It's their family. It's their being loved by somebody. It's all these things that really make a life. Was it worthwhile or was it not? So I thought, let's do this again, and this time we'll have both things. Let's have a guy who wastes his life both vocationally and emotionally. In 1989, The Remains of the Day won the Booker Prize. In an interview, he describes how he wrote the book during a 4-year period, which he and his wife Lorna refer to as the crash. He says, "During the crash, I would do nothing but write from 9 a.m. to 10:30 p.m., Monday through Saturday. I'd get 1 hour off for lunch and 2 for dinner. I'd not see, let alone answer, any mail, and would not go near the phone. No one would come to the house. Lorna, despite her own busy schedule, would for this period do my share of the cooking and housework. In this way, so we hoped, I'd not only complete more work quantitatively, but reach a mental state in which my fictional world was more real to me than the actual one. This fundamentally was how The Remains of the Day was written. Throughout the crash, I wrote freehand, not caring about the style or if something I wrote in the afternoon contradicted something I'd established in the story that morning. The priority was simply to get the ideas surfacing and growing. Awful sentences, hideous dialogue, scenes that went nowhere. I let them remain and plowed on. I kept it up for the 4 weeks, and at the end of it, I had more or less the entire novel down. Though, of course, a lot more time would be required to write it all up properly, the vital imaginative breakthroughs had all come during the crash. And writing for The Guardian in 2012, Salman Rushdie said of the novel, "Just below the understatement of the novel's surface is a turbulence as immense as it is slow. For the remains of the day is in fact a brilliant subversion of the fictional modes from which it seems at first to descend. The time-hallowed bonds between master and servant, and the codes by which both live, are no longer dependable absolutes, but rather sources of ruinous self-deceptions. Even the happy yokels Stevens meets on his travels turn out to stand for the post-war values of democracy and individual and collective rights, which have turned Stevens and his kind into tragic-comic acronyms. You can't have dignity if you're a slave, the butler is informed in a Devon cottage. But for Stevens, dignity has always meant the subjugation of the self to the job, and of his destiny to his masters. What then is our true relationship to power? Are we its servants or its possessors? It is the rare achievement of Ishiguro's novel to pose big questions. What is Englishness? What is greatness? What is dignity? With a delicacy and humor that do not obscure the tough-mindedness beneath. The 1993 film adaptation was nominated for and won a slew of awards, including Academy Award nominations for Best Picture, Best Actor in a Leading Role, Best Actress in a Leading Role, Best Director, and Best Writing. The movie is quite similar to the book. There are a few changes, but none that truly change the meaning of the book or what happens throughout the course of the pages. In the beginning, Stevens is reading a letter from Miss Kenton, whose marriage has ended. However, we also see an auction of Lord Darlington's assets and see the American Senator Lewis, played by Christopher Reeve, buy the hall. Although this is different from the Mr. Faraday who buys the hall in the book, this change does little to upset the balance of the narrative. Instead, it allows the viewer to see an even greater contrast between the man who previously owned the hall, whose political leanings were suspect, and the succeeding owner whose politics regarding the war were at odds with Darlington's. There is almost a greater emphasis on those who are on the right side of history with the exchange of the hall. And while the book certainly doesn't need to make this clear, it's also not unwelcome or heavy-handed in the film. An image of Stevens, played by Anthony Hopkins, opening the now empty hall, greets us. This is contrasted with scenes of the hall from previous years, bustling with guests and a full staff, with Stevens taking charge of it all, measuring the table settings with precision, and directing grand dinners. The hall is wonderfully constructed, with doors hidden in walls disguised as bookcases, and blending in with the other decor. In what will likely seem humorous to modern viewers, we also see Darlington shirking his responsibilities as a godfather to explain the facts of life to his godson, played by a very young Hugh Grant, before his marriage, and shuffling it off on Stevens. Stevens is also all kinds of awkward in trying to broach the subject through the metaphor of an expected change in the surroundings come spring. Hopkins plays condescension, masquerading as dignity, perfectly. He bristles at Miss Kenton, calling his father by his first name, even though the elder Stevens is an under-butler and Kenton, as the head housekeeper, is in a position of authority over him. He takes the opportunity to expound on the concept of dignity as the hall staff take their meal together. Yet, when questioned by the townsfolk on his drive to see Miss Kenton, he insists that he was only Darlington's butler, there to serve him, not to agree or disagree with his controversial political opinions. For someone who was once so proud of his work, his obvious lie betrays his own beliefs about whether he led a life of dignity. And Emma Thompson perfectly plays Miss Kenton with whip-smart sarcasm, immediately calling out Stevens for looking down on her abilities in the quiet way she can, bringing attention to the elder Stevens' errors and expressing concern for his ability to do his job and for his own good. However, in voicing her concerns, she is wounding Stevens' pride. Throughout, the actors are beautifully framed in numerous scenes, this framing revealing the unspoken and unacted upon warmth between them. In fact, any situation in which the two experience of emotional intimacy is shot in the shadows or facing away from each other, never showing each other their true feelings. It is hard to think of two better actors to inhabit these roles. As Miss Kenton and Stevens meet for the last time, their hands part in the rain, lit against the dark night, grief pulling at Miss Kenton's face as her trolley pulls away from Stevens. This is the kind of love story that I can get behind. Understated, realistic, and not always with a happy ending. This is the rare instance in which the film is equally great as the book it's based on. Up next in my year of Ishiguro is 1995's The Unconsoled, about a renowned pianist who arrives in a city he cannot identify for a concert he can't remember agreeing to give, but who comes to realize that he is facing the most crucial performance of his life. What does that mean? I have no idea, but I'm sure that in Ishiguro's hands, it'll be something amazing. Have you read The Remains of the Day, or have you seen the film? Let me know your thoughts on it in the comments. See you in the next video.